Good evening to everyone. I was a police officer for decades in Mexico, and that experience far surpasses all the horrendous things one witnesses over the years. I've decided to share this because it's been over 20 years since it happened, but even so, I recount it with great respect and still with chills merely from remembering it. At that time, I worked with my patrol partner, whom we'll call Lydia. We were good friends in addition to being co-workers, and this experience is not something new to me. Here begins my story. It was a night in October I remember well because it was very cold and there was lightning. A big storm was coming due to the very intense thunder. I recall we had just bought some burgers to eat right there in the patrol car since the night seemed calm. But suddenly everything changed. Around 11 p.m. we received an alert. We were urgently requested at a residence in the city. We didn't receive much context about the situation because the woman who had called emergency services was barely understandable, as she was crying a sea of tears and sobbing, which prevented the operator from understanding what was happening. She only urgently requested a police patrol and an ambulance because she said her nephew was badly injured. We arrived at the house very quickly because we were in the area. In fact, we were the first to arrive, and what we witnessed was horrifying. By then, the rain was pouring heavily, and the thunder was at its peak, adding more drama and horror to an already dreadful and terrifying situation. I remember Lydia knocked on the door, announcing we were the police. A woman, about 35 years old, who was crying and screaming for help, greeted us. She had red stains on her hands and clothes. Upon entering the house, we saw a boy about 6 years old at most, lying unconscious in the living room. I don't want to be explicit out of respect for the minor and you, but the scene was horrendous, something indescribable. Just then, the ambulance sirens were heard, and the paramedics entered immediately to assist the boy. Meanwhile, we asked the woman what had happened, who had done such a dreadful act to him. The woman, through tears, said she was the aunt of the children. We asked if there was another child in the house, to which she replied yes, her 11-year-old niece. She explained that their mother had left them alone because she worked at night, and she was supposed to stay with them. But when she entered the house, she saw something she still couldn't process. Her niece was inflicting wounds on her brother with a kitchen knife. She said the girl had an entirely different face. She seemed like another person and described her face as devilish, smiling in a bizarre, malevolent way that was so unfamiliar. The aunt then recounted how she started screaming at her niece, asking what she was doing, but kept her distance because she was in shock. Her niece just smiled back at her with what she described as a devilish grin. As she continued screaming, asking what she had done, the niece suddenly looked at her brother on the floor. Her expression changed to fright, and she ran upstairs and locked herself in her room, where she still was. The aunt said she didn't dare enter because she was afraid of her due to what she had done. By this time, the paramedics informed us that the boy had no vital signs. There was nothing more to be done. The woman began to cry uncontrollably, a very hard scene to witness. Now, it was our job to go up for the girl, to interrogate her and verify the aunt's story. So, Lydia and I went up to the only room with the door closed. Lydia knocked, speaking to her, hoping she would come out. Thinking that maybe the girl would be less afraid and more trusting of a woman, Lydia assured her we just wanted to talk, that nothing would happen to her. But the girl didn't open the door or respond. We tried to force the lock as breaking down the door would scare the girl, which we wanted to avoid. But while we were trying to force the doorknob, a voice, not that of a girl but a very deep male voice, started laughing from inside the room. This alarmed us, thinking someone else was there with the girl, possibly holding her hostage. So, we decided to break down the door. Upon entering, the first thing we saw was the girl sitting under her clothes hung in her closet, staring at us, smiling in a way I can't explain. A child of her age could not do that and have such malice in her eyes and smile. just as her aunt described. Lydia asked if she was all right, if there was anyone else with her, but she just kept staring at us with that sinister smile. Meanwhile, I began to inspect the room, which was very small, and there was no one else there with her. There wasn't even a TV in the room or anything that could have produced that macabre male voice we both had heard. Back then, modern cell phones didn't exist, and no radio was found in her room. The only window was barred. No one could have escaped through it. It was just her, and no one else. I was utterly baffled, and I'm sure Lydia was too. It meant that the girl herself had emitted that macabre laugh with a male voice. Lydia approached her carefully, but then the girl started running towards her. That's when I had to help Lydia control her. The girl was screaming and kicking, trying to escape, so we had to restrain her. It was one of the hardest things I've done in my duty as a police officer. The girl had red stains all over her clothes as well as on her hands and feet. It was evident she had something to do with what had happened to her brother. We also found the kitchen knife thrown under her closet. The girl was taken for questioning along with her aunt and mother, who was later informed of the incident. It was confirmed that the girl had committed the crime, and she herself confessed everything. But she said something that chilled everyone to the bone. "He made me do it." Psychological evaluations were performed, and she was found to be mentally sound, not suffering from any mental illness or psychological disorder. So, we couldn't explain why she did what she did, as when asked, she only repeated, "He made me do it." Upon questioning the mother and the girl's aunt, the aunt mentioned that her sister, the children's mother, had recently met a man who was her partner. He made her perform satanic rituals and such in their own home, brainwashing her into believing that they would become millionaires and move to another country together, among other things. This allowed for such activities to occur in their home. Since this man came into their lives, the girl began to change her behavior. She became aggressive, used foul language, and had sudden mood swings. The aunt also caught her talking to someone in her room on multiple occasions, but upon checking, found no one else with her. Strange occurrences also began to happen in the house, like glass dishes falling from the cupboard in the middle of the night or unexplained noises. The mother admitted to all of this. Indeed, she and her partner were conducting these rituals in the early hours after returning from work, as they were also co-workers. Various ritual books and some voodoo dolls were found in the house. In conclusion, the girl was placed in juvenile custody, and the mother was released. I didn't follow up on the case, but I consider what happened to be completely paranormal. Lydia and I witnessed that unforgettable scene, the girl with eyes full of fury and cynicism, along with her macabre smile, something we could never explain or forget. Perhaps the girl was possessed by a demon, which is why she did what she did. As I mentioned, she was psychologically sound, and she herself confessed, "He made me do it." What really happened that night, I leave to your judgment. Hey community, I have a paranormal story about my father during his career as a police officer in the city. We are from Chile, and this happened many years ago, but I think it's worth sharing his anecdote with you. Honestly, it's quite eerie, and leaves many questions about reality. My father's name is Diego, and at the time he patrolled the city streets with his partner Andres. One early morning, they received a radio order to head to a residence very close to where they were. Some neighbors on that street had called emergency services because they heard sinister screams coming from a house they said was abandoned, believing that something very bad was happening to someone inside. But of course they dared not enter themselves. They asked that the patrol hurry. My father, who was driving, sped up to reach the location as quickly as possible. He says that when he entered that street, there were some people there who, upon seeing the patrol car, gestured for them to come over. They were the same neighbors who had reported the incident, almost all in pajamas since it was late at night, although he doesn't remember the exact time. My father and his partner got out of the patrol car, and before the neighbors could say anything, my father recounts that a woman's scream came from that house, which indeed looked abandoned at first glance. They asked the people on the street to go back inside their homes since it was very dangerous for them to be out if the officers had to draw their weapons. They told them to leave, and that they would handle it. The people had to comply, but many curious onlookers continued to peek out their windows. My father and his partner knocked on the door of the house, which was in very bad condition. They shouted that if anyone was inside, they should surrender, that they were going to enter by force, and it would be better for them to come out with their hands up. But they received no response, only another heart-wrenching scream, which my father says chilled him to the bone. Listening to it was like hearing something horrible being done to what seemed like a woman, something that caused her great pain. My father's partner kicked the door down, which fell to the floor as it only needed a single kick due to its age. Both entered with their flashlight and gun in hand, illuminating every corner of the house. They could not see anything on the ground floor apart from a lot of garbage and bad smells, cobwebs everywhere, and some pieces of old furniture. The first floor was empty, there were no people or even animals in the place. But suddenly they heard noises from the floor above. My father says it sounded like something dragging, as he describes it. And although the screams had stopped, they slowly ascended the stairs, following the protocols they must in such situations. Upon reaching the upper floor, they started to illuminate every corner with their flashlights. But to their surprise, there was absolutely no one there. My father says there was no place to hide, or windows through which someone could escape if they were there and fled upon hearing them. Moreover, the last scream was heard after they had already entered. They couldn't find anything, but in a part of the second floor, which my father says was like the house's main bedroom, there was a circle on the floor with a giant pentagram and many things written on the wall in another language. And he says these things were written with feces. They cordoned off the place so that no one could enter, as although they found no one inside, it was not safe for obvious reasons. He says they interviewed some neighbors to get context on the situation. They mentioned that the horrible screams started around 1 in the morning. At first they didn't know where they were coming from, but upon opening their windows, or some who went out of their houses to see what was happening, they realized the sounds were coming from that abandoned house. Initially, everyone was very scared and puzzled since that house had been uninhabited for some years. But on some nights, several had seen individuals entering through one of the front windows of the house late at night to do who knows what inside. They preferred to lock themselves in and not go out to investigate, afraid that these people might harm them as they did not look trustworthy, and nothing good could come from someone entering an abandoned house late at night. That was generally the testimony of the neighbors who called the police, but they never found out who the horrible screams and moans were coming from. My father has a theory that it was some demon, since it was obvious that satanic rituals had been performed there, based on what they found on the second floor and the neighbors' testimonies, who had seen men entering there just a few days before. So, for him, it was more than clear. Obviously, they couldn't put that in the report, so it simply remained unresolved. Later, they ordered the demolition of that house since it belonged to no one, and we don't know if it still remains as a vacant lot because we no longer live there. Thank you for listening to my story. Have a good evening, everyone. This story was always told to me by my uncle, who was a local police officer throughout his entire life. Now he is retired, but he has many anecdotes and experiences, both good and bad, from his career. In this line of work, you come across so many things. He always shared almost all of his most intense experiences, so I have many to tell. However, on this occasion, I want to share one that was among the strangest, and at the same time, the saddest that happened to him. He recounts that one night, he was at the police station when they received a call from a little girl who was asking for help for her brother. It was a very sweet voice, that of a little girl no older than 6 years old, or so he was told at the time of receiving the alert. He and his partner headed to the address the little girl had given, though they didn't really know what was happening. The girl didn't say much, only that her little brother needed help, that their parents were bad and that they should please hurry. When they arrived at the house, which by the way he said was very neglected with lots of trash in the yard and untrimmed grass, they knocked on the door. A man opened it, but only a few inches, not enough to see inside, nor the man entirely, just a part of his face. My uncle mentioned they had received an emergency call from that address. He also mentioned that a little girl was asking for help for her brother, and politely asked if he could enter to check and ensure everything was in order. He noticed that the man was annoyed and wasn't going to let them in when, in a curt manner, he simply said, "No girl lives here." My uncle and his partner insisted, saying that otherwise they would obtain a warrant to enter, and things would get worse. So, they managed to persuade the man to let them into the house. There in the living room there was a woman sitting on the couch watching TV. When questioned by my uncle and his partner, they said they only had a son, as their daughter had died a few months ago. My uncle asked to verify this by entering the 2 bedrooms to see if the little boy was there, and to check that no girl was present. Upon entering the children's bedroom, they saw something that set off alarms for them. The little boy was lying on his bed with marks of beatings on his face and arms. Indeed, the child needed help as his parents were mistreating him. It was not explicit, but it was clear they did not care for him. After rescuing the boy and following all the protocols required in such cases, it was also verified that these people were telling the truth. The girl, who was the elder sister of the boy, had died 2 months earlier due to an untreated illness. The deceased girl had called the police to help her brother. No other explanation could be found. The call was recorded in the emergency call archives, where my uncle could listen and verify that indeed a girl had called asking for help for her brother. Of course, this is something that remains under the custody of the police. It never came to light, and I don't think it ever will. It's something they could never find any explanation for, except for the paranormal. Hi everyone. I want to share with you this story that happened to me a few years ago that I consider a paranormal and unexplained event. You see, I am a traffic police officer and I patrol only at night on various roads in my state. I should mention that I live in the United States. I was born here, but my entire family is from Mexico, so I consider myself one of them too. My job involves ensuring that drivers don't exceed the speed limit, wear their seat belts, and have legal license plates, among many other things. Here, all of that is very important, and the fines are hefty if these rules are broken. One night, while driving my patrol car on a somewhat busy highway and carrying out my duties as usual, I noticed a small hand waving goodbye from the back of a van ahead of me. It was in the trunk of this closed van, which is illegal to transport minors in due to the danger it entails. Everyone must be seated in the seats with their seatbelts fastened. So, I had to do my job, and decided to get a little closer to this van to verify if it was indeed a minor. And sure enough, it was dark, but with my patrol car's lights I could see the silhouette of a small child waving goodbye to me with their little hand, to which I also said goodbye, but I had to do my job because it was dangerous for the child to be in the trunk. So I turned on the lights and made the van stop. I stopped behind them, got out of the patrol car and walked up to the van, where there was an American couple, a man and a woman in their 40s. I explained to them why I had stopped them. The first thing the man asked was if there was a problem. When I mentioned that they couldn't have their son in the trunk of the van, they looked very surprised. I turned back, but I could no longer see the child. And that's when they told me, "No one else is with us." I kindly asked them to get out of the vehicle so I could inspect it thoroughly, as I was sure of what I had seen. But indeed, there was no child there, just the 2 of them. I apologized to them, insisting on what I had seen, that perhaps it was a shadow, but I was sure I had seen a minor waving goodbye from the trunk of the van. At which point, the woman suddenly said, "Maybe it's Josh. This van belonged to my sister and her son died here years ago. He had heart problems and didn't make it to the hospital." Her husband laughed sarcastically, obviously skeptical about what his wife had recounted. He apologized for what he said and asked if they could leave. I too apologized for the mistake and told them they could go. The next day, while reviewing the patrol car's cameras, there it was, the shadow I saw. So, I confirmed it was real, and not just my imagination. There was the shadow of a child waving goodbye from the trunk of that van. I had checked it thoroughly, even lifting the seats because it involved a minor who could possibly be in danger. But there was no one there. To this day, it's something that leaves me pondering for hours because I had never seen anything like it before. I had never seen a ghost in my life, and having it happen at my job made it even more dramatic.